Hello, welcome to Skyscanner Horizons, the Return of Travel, our webinar. We're just going to give it a couple of minutes for everybody to join. Hope everyone is keeping cool on what is a relatively warm day in most of Europe at the moment. Just a few more moments while we let people join. And then we will kick off. So hello again, I'm Stephanie Boyle. I'm the head of industry relations here at Skyscanner, and I'm looking forward to being your moderator and host for the next hour. Thank you for joining us today. We're pretty excited to have a relatively full house representing most of the travel sector, which is always great. And we've got a great lineup of speakers today, so I hope you're going to leave with some valuable insights and takeaways as we are all navigating the return of travel. A quick overview of what we're going to be covering today. It's a 1-hour session. We're going to kick off with Skyscanner's Chief Commercial Officer, Stuart Middleton. He's going to give us his opening remarks and his view on the sector overall. And then Hugh Aitken, our VP of Flights, will present some of the top line findings from our recently published Skyscanner Horizons Return of Travel report. Then Skyscanner's VP of Commercial Innovation, Kay Chung, is going to provide an update on the latest consumer sentiment insights from the last month and talk about some traveler innovation trends we're seeing. And we're also really pleased to be joined today by Nick Hall, who's the CEO of Digital Tourism Think Tank, who's going to give us a view from the destination's perspective. Nick can give a wave. And also by David Rutnam, who is the regional manager of industry distribution program adoption at IATA. He's going to walk us through early signs of recovery in the aviation sector. We will spend the rest of the afternoon, most of the afternoon ideally, or the hour, in a roundtable where we're going to be discussing some of the trends that we expect to last and which ones we think might be temporary, and exploring some of the key areas for collaboration within the sector. I'm sure most of you are relatively familiar with virtual events at this stage, but a few housekeeping notes from me anyway. We'd love to hear your questions, so please do submit any questions that you have through the Q&A box, and we'll aim to ask those during the roundtable or throughout the session. We'll follow up afterwards on any questions that we're not able to get to today. And just a reminder, in case you didn't check your email, that we are recording this session, and we'll be happy to send a recording of this following the event. So, without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Stuart Middleton for his opening remarks.
Thanks, Stephanie. Welcome, everybody. We're having a couple of Zoom glitches, so apologies while I try and fast forward. Here we go. We're on the starting slide. So, yeah, welcome, everybody. Good afternoon, good morning, or good evening, wherever you are. My name is Stuart. I'm CCO at Skyscanner. I've been here since 2009, from when we were quite small, sort of 25 staff, but now I lead the commercial function. Leading the commercial function, I'll give a special welcome to many of our commercial partners that I hope are on the call today. We've got 1,200 in total commercial partners that bring really brilliant services and products to our travelers. So thank you for that for the last decade or so, whatever, but particularly through this difficult period, which certainly caught us all by a bit of a surprise. But nonetheless, I thought it was important to maybe look back a little bit, back to November 2020, before we look forward to where we are right now. And to do that, I thought I'd revisit a time where back in November within Skyscanner, we have a company update, which is held every year or so. It's very much to give an idea of what the company's doing and where we're going. But during that session, it was a couple of days session, I posed 3 questions, which were, will people ever travel again? Will a vaccine become available? Will travelers still require our services? And looking back on that in hindsight, so 8 months later, you can see that, these are pretty big, meaty, somewhat existential questions, but that's very much how we felt back in November. We'd had a difficult autumn, and it looked very much like the winter was going to be a hard one, and in many ways it was. But it was very much to highlight, I guess, how we felt at the time, and I suppose also to look at where we are now. And the way that I wanted to pose it to our staff and to our teams was that actually, it's when, it's not if. all these things will become better. People will travel again. A vaccine will become available and travellers will require our services, that's for sure. But what was interesting was, coincidentally, about 2 or 3 days later, the first Pfizer vaccine was actually announced, it was authorised. And that very much, that sort of first week in November was probably the first piece of good news we'd had in a long time. And you could start to see that the light at the end of what had been a very, very dark tunnel. And when you fast forward now, you look back on these questions, you say, well, clearly they're all yes, they will be yes. And that's really the good news, is that, as it stands now, all of these areas they're massively improving. And when we poll our travellers, and it's not just Skyscanner travellers, it's actually a broader constituency of travellers, 93% of travellers are now actively thinking and planning about a trip, which is a substantial change from what it was at the start of the year. And from the Skyscanner point of view, what's really pleasing is it's fairly consistent growth now. For the last 12 weeks or so, we've had really good growth in some of the larger European land masses of Germany, UK, France, Netherlands, Spain, and Italy, doing pretty good numbers consistently over the last 8 to 12 weeks, it's been nice to have a degree of predictability about that, which we certainly couldn't have said that before. It's not just in the European landmass, within the US, which has definitely been a more robust travel economy since COVID hit. 2.5 million people alone traveled over one weekend, and Memorial Weekend, which is a really startling figure, particularly when you actually underline that by saying 31 million people traveled in total, but 2.5 million were happy to get on an aircraft over a weekend and travel and see friends and family. So that's a really nice indicator for positive sentiment towards travel. And lastly, a really important statistic is this, that 330 million jobs are dependent on the travel industry. That's a substantial number, and I suspect that many people on this call are part of that 330 million. So it's really important that we are able to really get back to growing what's essentially it's an $8 or $9 trillion GDP, to bring that back into the global economy and allow the world to get back to business again. But as I was thinking about this more, Skyscanner's got brilliant data sets. They allow businesses to make great decisions, but sometimes the numbers really obscure the fundamental reasons, the fundamental challenges that we have. And the reality is that as humans, we've been starved of travel for 15 months, absolutely starved. Something that we thought was a God-given right has been taken away from us. And it stopped us from connecting with parents, with friends, with family, finding out about new cultures, learning about other people in the globe, which is for so long it's been just something that you took as a given. But we've been starved, we've been famished of that for a long period of time, and that's a fundamental reason for why travel needs to get back up to where it is. And as I was actually preparing for this presentation last night, I thought there's another human story to this, which takes away from the massive, robust data sets that Skyscanner has. And it's actually, for me, it's quite close to home. And this is a picture that was taken 2 weeks ago. And it's my mum and my dad. So as you can see, I've probably got grey hair in my future based on that photograph. But what was interesting was my mum and my dad have taken the lockdown really seriously. They've essentially spent the last 15, 16 months not straying far from home, spending a lot of time at home or going on walks around our local area. But now, thankfully, because they've been double vaccinated, as I am, I was double vaccinated on Friday. Thank you, NHS. They've now been double vaccinated for probably about 6 weeks or so. And they said, it's time to move on. It's time to get that building block back in our life and go and visit people. And for mum and dad, they love two things. They love going to see family. So we've got my cousin, my mum's niece lives in Jersey, and they love lighthouses. So they wanted to go back to a place that they love, which is Corbière Lighthouse. And they did that, and they had a fantastic time. And when they came back, I could see the vitality restored to them as a fundamental, a nourishment in their life came back and was there to be celebrated, which was a wonderful thing to see. So, and I suspect within a specific demographic, that's something that's going to happen more and more often, particularly in the population that's double vaccinated. So what I'm saying is we've got fantastic data, and I'd encourage you to keep looking at it. But there are human stories here where we can really make these connections and allow us as as a group of people to start to make these connections again and see the return to travel. And with that in mind, I'll pass over to Hugh, who's going to talk about the 2021 emerging trends and take us on that journey. So I'll pass now over to Hugh Aitken, who's VP Commercial at Skyscanner.
Thank you, Stuart. Thanks very much for that. I think it's interesting when we look at the data, we quite often lose the human connection of what we're here to do, which is enable people to travel and experience new cultures and go to different parts of the world. So, no, a really, really powerful way to end it, Stuart. Thank you. I'm going to bring us back to data, unfortunately, and talk about the kind of trends we're seeing in the market and what our data, looking at it from a global perspective, is showing us in terms of travel. Many of you have seen we've published, and we continually are publishing blogs around travel and what we're seeing going on in the market, the last one in mid-May. And we also published a big report a couple of months back called Skyscanner Horizons, which started to talk about what we're seeing as the latest trends in travel. So I'm going to go through a bunch of data that brings you up to date on that and lets you see what's happening in the market as we see it. But again, there's always a caveat to this. Will the short-term trends we see translate into long-term trends and a change in travel? And many of these things, we don't know the answer. But again, hopefully the insights here will give you a sense of what we are seeing in the market. And I'm hoping I can get this working, and apologies if I can't. I'll give it one more chance and then I'll ask you to help us here, Stephanie. Okay, that's me now. The first thing, we've talked a lot about domestic becoming much more prevalent, and I'm going to return to this point as I go through my presentation. But related to how we're seeing the market, we've seen domestic recovery in a whole bunch of markets. Stuart's touched on the US as a big market. We've also seen domestic recovery in China, of course. But equally, we're starting to see that translate into other parts of the world. Week on week, last week versus the week before, we saw a 71% increase in domestic travel in Canada as Canada starts to open state borders, 15% increase in Japan as Japan starts to ease into their Go to Travel campaign and thinking ahead for trying to encourage people to start traveling again. So we certainly see pent-up demand in domestic, but more importantly, we see that pent-up demand much more significantly. So as Portugal got added to the green list from the UK, unfortunately no longer there, but we'll leave that one for another day, and we saw a 616% increase in the people who were booking flights via Skyscanner for UK to Portugal. We've seen, and Stuart's touched on it already, we're continuing to see a really consistent and steady increase in our major EU, Northern European markets, travel, Germany, Spain, Netherlands, Italy, etc. 110% week on week increase in flight bookings in those markets. So we see significant pent-up demand. So we often talk about in travel and have done from we've got this wave of pent-up demand there. We see it time and time again. And I thought this graph brought that to life really well. So this is an internal data system we have, and this is looking at France as a market, and it's looking days a week for the last 10 days, and it shows in yellow what we saw last week, and green exactly the same time this week. So you can just see yesterday, the day before that, and you can see a huge spike on Monday, which was I think France started to lift restrictions on travel at the beginning of the week between France and Morocco. So big VFR market, but equally a big leisure market. So immediately, if not even slightly bit ahead of when these announcements are formally made, we see huge peaks in our travel demand for destinations as travel starts to ease. So again, it shows there's pent-up demand in the market. That just shows, indexing back to early May being our point 100 in here, you can just see that continual rise in demand for travel across Europe. So good trends there. One of the things that's really challenging is what's actually happening within that market. One of the first trends is the unpredictability of booking horizons. So this is people, but the days between people searching and people traveling. Before the pandemic, it was about 80 days. It then fluctuated up as people went places and stayed for longer. It dropped dramatically, not dramatically, but significantly last summer as people had to make shorter term decisions. And we saw some sort of predictability towards the end of last year, returning people planning their summer holidays. But again, it's fallen behind. I think this is going to be one of the real challenges for us is to understand the short-term nature of having to make travel decisions versus the more predictable nature of travel that we saw in the past. Where this settles, we don't know. We suspect it'll probably settle where it was before the pandemic in time. How long that takes and the fluctuations in that journey are yet to be seen. The other thing that's changing is people are staying longer in destinations. So day trips, weekend breaks are shortening. So this looks at trip durations, and versus the pre-pandemic, you can see, close over a 40% reduction in one-day trips, well, 15-20% reduction in two-day trips. So again, people staying for longer places and having shorter trip durations. That's driving destination, which I'll come back to in a minute. So again, domestic and short haul. Before the pandemic, domestic was 17% of Skyscanner's total searches in 2019. Last year, right now, it's 43% of our total searches on the site. So you can just see the growth of steady. That varies by region. Europe is slightly behind because people traveling with EU would be classed as short haul within this, not just domestic. But you can just see the difference. Look at the amount of people that are staying within the Americas, within their domestic markets, predominantly the US. 83% of that market is domestic. And not much short of that, 71% is APAC. Dipped very recently, actually, as travel bubbles are rumoured to open, but again, predominantly domestic markets. That, of course, is at the expense of ultra long haul, 17% down versus 2019. So again, a huge shift as markets like Australia and New Zealand keep their borders closed. I'm almost there. Two final bits to finish off. We've talked quite often, and there's a lot of conversations about what's happening to fares. And generally, we are still seeing fares lower than we were in 2019. So this compares fares now versus 2019 at the same point for travel in July, August, September. And you can see in just some examples there that fares, Canada domestic in August, 38% cheaper than 2019. In Italy to France in July, 34% cheaper. So in general, prices are cheaper than they were in 2019. But again, highly unpredictable. I think you'll see peaks in demand, and as any revenue managers who are on the line just now will attest, it's a hugely fluid market, and how you predict and how you do revenue management is going to be very fluid over the period of time. But in general, for the traveller, we're seeing cheaper prices. And finally, we're seeing different destinations being searched. So this looks at the index, so where all the destinations feature in our destination. So you can start to see people people move away from your big cities like Milan and Moscow and go to more leisure destinations who feel safe, feel familiar, and where we can actually travel to, like Faro and Heraklion, etc. And again, you can see the huge dominance of Miami in that, and also Sao Paulo, as domestic takes a huge center stage. And at that stage, Stephanie forwarded this slide already. That was a good hint to move on. So I'm going to move on at that to Ki, who's going to pick up from here. Thank you.
Thanks, Hugh. Just looking to shift on. Perfect. So we're going to talk about what innovation means in a traveller first environment, especially through a pandemic. And one of the first things we realized is that risk appetite was going to be a crucial measure of how recovery was going to look like and the shape of recovery. So right at the beginning of the pandemic, knowing that our partners wouldn't have the bandwidth to spare focus on items such as this, we launched a global sentiment survey to help us understand the risk appetite of our travellers, to help us understand what they were thinking about the pandemic. And as you can see, this gave us access to real-time traveller sentiment over time. And we can see things are getting better. But when we drill down by region, we can see that EMEA, as mentioned previously, and the US has significantly better perspective on how the pandemic is going. But once we drill down into how the recovery is happening, it's actually quite different, with Hugh having mentioned that in the US, the focus is on domestic, whereas there's a bit more of a mix in Europe. In Asia, however, we can see that the attitude to the pandemic has broadly stagnated, which has resulted in a similar attitude towards travel. So how does this actually translate into visitor intent? As Stuart mentioned, 93% of people are thinking and planning a trip. And you can see here it's broadly split 50-50. And less people have no intention when they come to our platform. So people are dreaming and getting more confident. In terms of the principles of innovation, we think about four things: being traveller first. How can we support the traveller on their next stage of their journey in planning? What information can we surface them? What confidence can we give them? We want to talk about bringing to market additive solutions that scale. We want to solve problems that we have, that the traveller has, but also that our partners have as well. So a great example of this is that global sentiment survey that allowed us insights into the attitudes of travellers when they're thinking about recovery. Data-driven iteration and optimization, we're constantly testing and learning. And ultimately, we want to leverage our unique attributes to help drive recovery and drive insight across the travel industry. A great example of this is Aurora module that we have in our Travel Insights tool. This was originally an in-house tool which looked to combine the Johns Hopkins cases with the search demand data that we have on our platform and also the global sentiment data. And this was used to inform the type of messaging we wanted to go to market with. So do we decide to educate or inspire depending on the attitude of the travelers in the market and the caseloads? The pandemic's also brought upon a new type of data from should know to must know. And I'm going to touch upon some of the innovations that are helping travelers understand the must know. So the key here is to build traveler confidence by surfacing information. And the key information points that we found that travelers wanted to know about was guidance on restrictions, understanding how flexible the policies were, and understanding health and safety measures. So the must know here, can I go? So this interactive COVID map that we built allowed visualization of what the travel restrictions were and allowed travelers to make an informed decision on where to go. Next must know, can I change my plans? And so here we've surfaced the flexible policies on the tickets. We also surfaced cancellation policies. And in addition to that, we actually brought to market a COVID insurance offering, which allowed comprehensive cover for a pandemic, during a pandemic, which it was no mean feat in and of itself. And effectively, this allows travelers to move forward with peace of mind, and is available in Path and is rolling out beyond European markets now. And then finally, what safety measures does the traveler need to know about? So we surface airline confidence ratings, which is like a safety score, which is based on a few different parameters marked out of 5. And this includes things like daily clean on planes and face masks, etc. What's been really encouraging is that travelers actually look at these scores and interact with those that are rated higher. And we've actually seen a gradual increase in the scores from 4.2 to 4.8 over the last 6 months. And then from a digital health pass perspective, we're a technology company and we believe technology is going to really help accelerate recovery. And so we took a 3-pronged approach to understanding how we could be additive to this solution. So 1, by talking to the industry, and that's like, amongst others, IATA and Common Pass. 2, we surfaced it to our travelers to help them understand how this information could help them with their travel plans. And then 3, we surveyed our travelers to understand what their sentiment was to, and how willing they would be in terms of sharing this data. The good news is that 4 out of 5 actually are very willing to carry and share this data if it means that they can travel more freely. And so I'm going to pass on to Nick, who's going to talk about where they could travel more freely.
Hi, well, thank you very much. It's amazing to see the huge investment and work that the team at Skyscanner have made. So I'm the first Skyscanner outsider on this panel, and I just want to take this moment while absorbing all of that to compliment the whole team on their efforts. I think data is clearly so important right now, being able to understand what's happening right now and being able to try our very best to make some kind of predictable forecasts. But I think seeing all of those innovation examples also shows us how quickly we need to react and how agile we need to be during these current times. So I'm just really impressed by that. I'm going to touch on 5 different things. My perspective and my background is working with all of the destinations around the world. So we have the destination perspective here. I think the first thing to look at is to understand what's going on. So we've looked a lot about the pent-up demand, and we've tried to understand where that's coming from, how that's reacting, and how as an industry, we can quickly jump onto those opportunities as they arise. But the other perspective of that is the shift in demand. And I think this is equally important. If we focus only on the short term, we risk losing sight of the long term. So obviously through the data, what we can see is this huge shift towards island and coastal destinations. I think this is really poignant. And this is something that not only those destinations can step up to and really take advantage of this moment right now, not just to tap into it today, but actually to try and build on those opportunities in the long run, but also to think about the staycation and the short haul market and how to really turn that into something that's more sustainable, more meaningful long term. So I think that's a really big opportunity. But obviously what we're seeing here, and the data shows this in its starkest form, is the importance of trust and consistency. And the message from governments when it comes to the regulations, right through to how we communicate that, and the reliance that we can have on that is really, really key. And it's sending the market completely crazy. So this is a really, really key point that we need to address. And the other thing, I think those increases are phenomenal, but we have to remember we're starting from very low baselines, as we were talking about that absolute stop in travel. So this is something we need to just consistently keep working on. The other side of that is a shift in demand. So this is where we need to think longer term. We need to think about the role that destinations can play in building demand, especially, for example, in the off season, especially when we extend beyond the summer period, to making sure that we fill in that change in behavior that's actually happening in the market. We're all in a business environment right now, and the vast majority of us are working from home. And this may well have been a webinar happening in a conference room in London, but it's not. And we have to assess how much of this will remain in place. And of course, that's very difficult to predict. Obviously, on the leisure side, there's also a huge shift in how we live our lives. Our lives have fundamentally changed. The value of money, of going out, of enjoying life has completely transformed. And in some ways, we now appreciate that a lot more. But in other ways, we might question that restaurant or that city trip in a way that we perhaps didn't before. So this is something we need to think about in the long term. And ultimately, this is where the industry and destinations play a really key leadership role in bringing the industry together to think about how to nurture and rebuild trust over time. The second thing, which I think really builds on that, is we talk a lot about BAU, business as usual. And we need to understand that that is completely out of the window. I still hear today people talking about the return and when things go back to normal. And of course, this is exactly what everybody wants, but we have to recognize that that's extremely unlikely to happen. What we're doing right now is returning to travel. We're not returning to normal. The market has changed and everything with it has changed. We also have to be ready to respond and react. So these changes that are shown in the data are very hard to predict. So we need to have our partnerships and alliances ready to go. That means co-op marketing is a really, really valuable way to react and stimulate demand, where the destination can work together with the industry. But we need that agility to be ready for that, be ready with committed budgets, with creative, with messaging, and with the right tactics to respond as those markets open up so that we can really win from those. But as I said before, not forgetting the long term. So this is where the brand strategy needs to be maintained. We saw at the very beginning a lot of really impressive and very, very rich content around dream now, travel later. And this is something which I think is a huge credit to the industry. And we shouldn't forget the creativity that came out of the industry back then, and make sure we retain this going forward, because this was something really, really strong. And I think it's really important that we don't forget to build the brand, especially in markets that are not yet ready to travel. And there are quite a few. So this is something to really think about. The third is investing in the product and the experience offer. And this touches a little bit on what Kay was talking about. The role of innovation in this is absolutely fundamental. The importance of going through those user journey mapping and really understanding and applying empathy through the whole visitor cycle from end to end, from every single perspective. This is really key. And it's also something that needs to be done at a destination level, not only at a product level. For example, in that Skyscanner interface, you've got a very clear user journey, but it also needs to go right out to the macro level, where we think about that user journey for our visitors. What is that trip like from beginning right through to the end? And how can we work as an industry to remove those barriers and pain points and really address the issues? And a lot of those issues will be around trust, but there'll also be many, many practical issues as well. When we talk about products and experience, there's so much creativity happening in the industry. And I just want to touch on a few which really stood out for me in the last few months. There's Paris Tourism that have, for example, pivoted their city card to French citizens. They've recognized that move towards the staycation market. And they've said, well, this product, which is for a global tourist, is perhaps not appropriate in its current form. And they've completely reinvented what that looks like so that it has value for French people. And I think this is just a small example of pivoting. We also see cities like Tokyo creating brilliant perspectives through content. One I love is called Another Tokyo, which shows parts of Tokyo that are just completely surprising. And they touch on the nature, the outdoors, farms, and things that you really don't associate with that image of a very densely populated city. So again, understanding that perhaps the demand has changed and we should talk about something a little bit different when we think about the destination. We also see destinations like Visit Philadelphia, really tapping into the local market and creating podcasts where they can create a deeper connection, where they can stimulate spend at a local level more frequently and in a deeper way. And ultimately, what these destinations are doing is understanding consumer psychology, understanding the impact of the pandemic, and understanding the shift in the state of mind and addressing that through content, which can really be very effective, in particular when you work with partners. Okay, the fourth is transparency, depth, and perspectives. What I would say here is use the data, read the data, and understand what's going on, and answer every question. Use digital keyword data, travel research, as we've been seeing here, and understand your consumer. Show the journey from end to end, literally. This particularly applies for destinations. This is where content allows you to create that transparency, but data also allows you to create a different level of transparency. And that is all about building trust and confidence. Provide a deeper discovery, something that's perhaps more authentic, build on longer form content, which we've seen is a huge rise right now with on-demand video in particular being one of those key trends, to build more engagement with audiences. Understand that travel research goes beyond flights. It goes right down to, can I travel? How can I travel? What does that look like? Will I have to queue? Will I have to fill in X, Y, and Z forms? So really work on those long tail answers and focus on values and understand what's driving consumers and the bigger issues that consumers have become increasingly socially conscious about. And the very last point is building resilience. Do not ignore the off-season. This is really key. I spoke at the beginning about the change in particular in business travel, which frankly, I don't think anybody can predict right now because we're not back to business travel, but we can expect it to change. Invest in diversifying and adapting the product offer, particularly if we think about the MICE sector. Think about how to create new reasons and different reasons to travel, and the importance to add value to that. We've seen a sort of shift towards focusing on nomadic workers, for example. This is just one example of how people are starting to expect the business environment to change quite significantly. So recognize that's happening, but at the same time, building resilience is also about setting very ambitious long-term goals. This is now the opportunity, but also the expectation from the wider consumer. What are your commitments to sustainability? And what is the path and journey that you're setting out to achieve those? And use that transparency to commit to that. And perhaps that's also about building a more meaningful, longer stay and a more connected form of travel that we perhaps haven't really appreciated so much in the past. Leverage the importance of this to make the offer, the value, and the contribution of the visitor economy much richer, and certainly think about the bigger picture as well as the short-term things that are happening in the market right now. I hope that's given some ideas for our discussion later on, and handing back to Stephanie.
Thank you so much, Nick. It's really great to get that perspective from on the ground and what destinations can do to be resilient. We're also delighted, obviously, to have a view from the world of aviation and on the changing economic landscape of that sector. So with that, I'm going to hand over to David Ruttenham, who will take it away.
Thank you, Stephanie. And as the second outsider, I also thank you and your team at Skyscanner for putting this great event together. So in case anyone doesn't know, we're an association of roughly 300 airlines. And I have some slides that will be that have been put together by our economics team last week, so they're quite fresh. And I also will touch at the end on IATA Travel Pass, which is the solution we're working on to enable travel to ramp up again. So several of my slides are going to echo points that Hugh and Kay mentioned. And the first one, which I'm going to, whoops, having problems here. Okay, whoops, go back one. Sorry, it's a bit of a lag. And I think it was Hugh who pointed out about when the travel restrictions were lifted in the UK and the traffic light system came in, we saw a huge surge in travel, particularly to those green countries, which actually was higher than at the same period in 2019, which I guess you would expect because, whoops, I'll go back one. Which I guess you would expect because people have in 2019 had probably previously booked for the summer. And then, of course, once the restrictions were lifted on the 7th of May, then there was a huge surge. But how is that? Whoops. Okay, so what does this mean for the medium long term? So we're estimating if the border travel barriers are removed, we've effectively seen a kind of 2 years of lost growth in travel. And while that is pretty hard hitting, it kind of we are still seeing that that there is a kind of path to recovery. What does that mean for the airlines in terms of revenue? We're expecting that by the end of 2021, airlines will be at 55% of their revenue compared to 2019. So they have been really hard hit. And of course, that's going to impact their ability to invest for the future. And this was a point that Kay mentioned about where we're seeing the recovery. Within Europe, we've seen the slowest, and that makes perfect sense. Most of the travel within Europe is international short haul, and that's where you're finding that the restrictions are impacting greatly. Where you've got big domestic markets, then the recovery has been much quicker. So that's a kind of overlook of the economic conditions surrounding the airlines. What are we doing in order to address that? So one of the big issues is the actual getting through an airport and getting onto a plane. And so we've put together IATA Travel Pass. There are, of course, a number of other solutions out there. And that is aiming to address those issues. And we estimate that if travel were to get back to anywhere like 2019 levels, but based on the checks that people currently have to do, for example, if you get to 75% of 2019 levels with the same number of staff doing the checks, you're looking at a 5.5 hour process delay at an airport. And if we get to 100%, you're looking at an 8 hour delay. And of course, on short haul particularly, that's completely a non-starter. So we've developed a Travel Pass app. It's based on 4 modules that address 3 functions. The first one is a contactless app, and that's about creating a digital ID. And it's something we were working on before COVID-19, and it was to address capacity issues that a number of airports were reaching. They were getting full to capacity, and one of those friction points on flows through airports is having to produce that ID. And this is something we're aiming for beyond COVID-19. It's that use of biometrics and enabling contactless presentation of your ID. The second function that's being addressed is a rules database, specifically looking at COVID-19 rules and regulations. And this is built upon Thematic, which I'm sure many of you are aware of. It's been enhanced to cover COVID-19's rules, regulations, which are changing quite regularly. And this is used in two ways. The first is to be able to, for airlines to be able to notify travelers what are their requirements for their destination. And the second aspect of it is to check once they've done their test or uploaded their vaccination certificate to make sure that they've met the requirements of the authorities. So the test hasn't expired, it's not a positive test, it's the right kind of test. And the third function, which is based on 2 modules, is a lab solution. And the first is a directory of laboratories. And this will enable travelers to be able to identify where they can go to do the appropriate test for where they're traveling. And the other is an API, a lab API that enables laboratories to communicate information securely from their results to the traveler's device, and then from traveler's device they can then share that with border authorities, airlines, whoever may need that. And just finishing on the point of trust, it's built on trust, where we ensure that all of the data is owned and controlled by the traveler. So there's no external database holding any of their personal information. So it's fully data privacy compliant. And we have built that trust in that we've got a network of laboratories that are able to communicate results. When we have access to vaccination certificates, we'll be able to scan those and check with issuing authorities. So we'll be able to ensure that anything like faked or tampered with results aren't presented to the authorities. And with that, Stephanie, I'll hand back to you for the next stage of the session. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much. It's great to have that view of, obviously, it's nice to see somebody else is seeing similar trends to what we're seeing on Skyscanner. It just goes to show that really is what's happening as a global picture. And also to hear about IATA's innovation in the space in terms of developing the travel pass and the tech that's going to need to facilitate reopening travel. And that brings us on to our roundtable discussion. And I've seen we've got a few questions in the Q&A already, so thank you so much for sharing those. I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing the presentation so that you can see everybody. But I think before we get into the Q&A, I would like just to touch on a theme that was brought up in most of your presentations, which was this idea of, are these trends or these areas of innovation or these creative ways of thinking, are they going to stay? And how is that going to manifest itself, do you think, even if we don't know precisely which ones may stay? What do you think we should make sure that we're keeping? If I can come to you first, Kay, it'd be great to hear what you think we can learn from this and take forward.
Yeah, I think what's really important is listening to the traveller. We want travel to return, but it's complex. So how can we help to make it simple? How can we help to leverage, our skills in technology to help educate and shape what that new way of travel looks like? I think, things that are going to inspire confidence and trust. The governments are going to have a huge role to play in terms of the restrictions. And then we've got a role to play in terms of how we surface that in a timely, clear and accurate way so that people feel enabled to take that next step.
Definitely. I don't know if Nick or David, you had a view on that either.
Yeah, I think innovation around digitization and giving travelers or removing all of those pain points from travel. So with us, we're looking at that contactless. So I think smooth, you should be able, it was a project we worked on before COVID-19, it was fast travel, if you maybe have heard of that. Having that frictionless travel through an airport is going to be quite something to go ahead with.
Yeah, I think this word digitalization is something we've always worked on for more than 10 years, and we'd almost moved forwards and started focusing on sustainability and things like that, which have become, and then suddenly in January this year, not even March last year, we've been flooded, absolutely inundated with requests, help us work through digitalization at an industry, policy, strategy level. So there's clearly a recognition that things have changed and that digital has suddenly catapulted in its importance for consumers and for businesses. And I think what leaders like Skyscanner are doing and can demonstrate is how important that is. And, digitalization is all in the detail now. It's optimizing that granularity of pain points and barriers and trying to alleviate those. And that's the educational journey that's sometimes difficult to work through. People get very excited about something like blockchain, but actually we need to work through the customer's problems, and see how digital can help support and change that. So, in the destination, for example, the need for contactless experiences, the need for a kind of digital service level is so important now. And those businesses that are not transforming quick enough and adapting are finding that they're missing out. And they're actually not only not addressing the needs right now, but they're gradually losing the pace and the momentum in terms of competitiveness, as many in the industry are moving rapidly forwards, and consumers are increasingly comfortable with this and expecting it, because we're all used to scanning to check into venues and God knows what else digitally. So, there is a level of fluency with digital, which has just seen a massive upgrade during the pandemic.
And in terms of keeping up with some of that competition and that need for digitalization, one of the questions we have in the Q&A is around Google, the Google travel offering becoming a major competition for OTAs, and how OTAs can prepare for this future. I don't know if anybody would like to risk an answer to that one, but just around how can travel players and OTAs like others prepare for the future and ensure that they remain competitive and differentiated. Hugh, is that something you'd want to venture a response for?
Thanks for that one, Stephanie. At the end of the day, travel is one of, if not the most competitive industry. How you talk to the channels to consumers, the competitor dynamic with, if you're in an airline, how the other airlines are competing against you. It's a hugely fluid and competitive environment. I think Google is just another channel for one. I won't do Google's job for them. I think they do it pretty well themselves. There are different ways to get to travelers, and we continually have to be evolving that as an industry. Be that building up more direct relationships, being more personalized in how we're talking to travelers. We're doing a huge amount in Skyscanner more about personalization and building that product relevant to you as a consumer, and making sure that with our partners, we're giving them the traffic and the travelers who when they land on their site or book via our direct booking offering, are qualified and are ready to book. And I think that's our job. It's certainly as Skyscanner, that's what my focus is, and Stuart Keys on how do we make Skyscanner better and better every day? How do we make sure we're getting travelers into Skyscanner, and we're making sure that we're providing the offering that helps them connect with our partners and helps our partners represent themselves in Skyscanner. So our job every day is just to make sure we're connecting those two pieces of the pie, and we're making it easier and easier for travelers and our partners to connect via Skyscanner. And competition is something we're used to, and it'll just carry on, and we'll keep on evolving and keep on developing, and that's the magic of travel in many ways.
I think I would echo that. There are alternatives to Google, and Skyscanner is a pretty good one. And they're a formidable competitor, and my goodness, they keep us honest, that's for sure. One thing that we've always said, and it chimes with what I said at the start, Skyscanner's got 1,200 partners plugged into our platform. I suspect that's probably a lot more than Google Flight Search. So the breadth of content will be equally larger as well. So that's something that we continue to see as very precious and the key differentiator. So working with us, I'd say is a good foil. But don't get me wrong, Google's formidable, and they continue to grow, particularly in specific markets as well.
But they won't have the passion that we have for travel, surely. That's been demonstrated by everybody on the panel. Another question that we've got from the audience today is around some predictions. As the UK can now see an end to lockdown measures in sight, despite the recent extension, when does the panel believe that international travel restrictions might be eased? I'm wondering if David or Hugh, you'd want to venture a guess on that, educated guess.
That is a good question. Our experience is that because we are working with a lot of governments, we're looking at talking with the EU, talking with the UK government, and all over the world, and it's very hard to predict because they're quite well, not slow, but they're very reluctant to lift any restrictions. We don't know how the pandemic is going to go, if we're going to need booster vaccinations and things like this. But I think we are seeing more confidence. There's definitely more confidence. And when those restrictions are lifted, and they appear to be bilaterally at the moment, people do quickly start traveling again. So hopefully we'll see more and more of those restrictions lifted. and more countries open up, and then we'll see some kind of recovery, or at least the new normal.
Yeah, I just mirror that, David. I think, the number one concern, quite rightly, for governments all over the world has been the safety of their people and protecting their health services. And I think that's absolutely right. And that's made some very difficult choices for governments to make. I think it'll be, we are already seeing variability between countries, Stephanie. Some countries are being more open with borders for domestic even. Some of it's still restricted, but international, I think, is going to be highly variable globally, depending on vaccine rates and confidence of governments that they're seeing positive momentum and positive reductions in hospitalisation and mortality. So I'd mirror what you said, David. I think we certainly see, when we look at our numbers, it being highly variable globally. You see a number of our European markets opening up, and Germany in particular, and Netherlands and France. APAC feels as though opening those international borders will take longer, alongside vaccination rates and just and reducing the concern that national populations have as they're thinking about international travel.
And building on that, Hugh, I was going to come to you, Nick, with this, but we're talking about the pace of recovery differing across regions. And as we said, what we knew 6 months ago is perhaps different from today. It was definitely touted as vaccination rollout was touted as one of the critical areas to reopen travel. Whereas we've seen the UK and the US have a similar pace of vaccination rollout, their restrictions are now quite different in terms of return to travel, whereas Europe, it was slower, and now we're seeing a move towards opening up travel across the bloc. Nick, can you venture a guess as to why that's happening and why it's differing so much across the markets?
I think you do have a lack of good political alignment, to be completely honest, and a lack of real coordination sort of between different governments. So this is something which is a big roadblock for the industry, and that's why we see domestic, obviously, the first big rise. But we also see, if we take the European Union, a lot of joined up and coordinated efforts, and a lot of difficulties in getting to that point as well. But that's where we see progress. So I think where we're going to see some real challenges in the medium term is how quickly the world will open up. How quickly will we start to see travel between different regions in the world? And I think particularly of countries which have stood out for handling it so well, like New Zealand, Singapore, Taiwan, and Australia. It's a really big question now as to when they will also start to travel, because any form of opening up will surely lead to cases, which they've managed to avoid until now. So they almost, as we look at those markets, they almost seem stuck in in an impossible situation right now. So I think it's a very, very challenging outlook when we look at things realistically. I think what we can see last year and now this year again, pent-up demand, summer coming, COVID rates down. Hopefully they won't rise again and we won't see a return like we did last year, but it's a little bit early to say as well. And I think the problem with that is we're not going back to the normal pattern of 365 days. So we don't know what the impact is on city breaks, on short haul trips that are made very whimsically. What we're seeing right now is frustration from consumers, the desperation to get away. And we're not starting to see what is really any kind of normal and stabilized behavior. So a lot of unpredictability. And I think, I don't want to be the one who makes this guess, but I think this is going to be for at least another 2 years of gradual opening up as confidence builds, also in governments, and when they start to see the situation stabilize.
Yeah, I think you kind of answered another question that was in our chat, which was around that pace of return to travel. It talked about whether or not we might see, Europe is currently trailing the US, but might we see it leapfrog because there's just bigger pots of pent-up demand in certain regions? Is that something that, Hugh, you've seen over the course of the last 6 months? We've been looking at the data. Are you seeing certain regions have a stronger pot of pent-up demand so that when those restrictions are eased, we expect it to get really big, really fast, or are we seeing it already happening with the US leading?
I think it will be variable by market, Stephanie. So I think, what we do know is wherever it is, there's pent-up demand. I think the US is different because domestic travel has sustained a fairly significant level during the pandemic, and it's just carried on building. If you look at the daily stats, in the US, it's just gradually building back to where it was, 75, 76% of 2019 levels. But it's never gone to the level of air travel that we saw in Europe and particularly in Asia. So I think that's a different one. I think if you look at the peakiness we see in markets like Germany and Italy and France, I think we'll see real peaks of pent-up demand, just because international travel within the EU has been such a bigger portion of the total travel pie in those markets. And the US has been a bigger domestic market anyway, and I think that's remained relatively open during the whole thing. The question will be who's quickest to respond to those from an airline perspective, and typically that's kind of the LCCs who have a very quick ability to turn around schedules and aircraft and move aircraft and crew around their operating bases in Europe. And that's going to be interesting. The interesting thing will be, how does the industry respond to these very, very quickly? And when we see these peaks in demand, and just adds capacity from what can be, as David will know better than any of us, how complex that can be for airlines to manage schedules and crew and aircraft in a very complex network.
Yeah, and that's another question that's on here. We've definitely seen some examples of Lufthansa putting on a massive plane to cater for demand to Mallorca, but it is a really difficult thing to do. One of the questions that we had was, why are there such a large amount of schedule changes, and how does that then play on trust? So I wanted to come to you with David. Obviously it is. That is what the sector has to deal with. The changes have to come, but what's the knock-on impact on trust, on traveler trust and confidence, and what can we do about that?
Well, yes, with regard things like schedule changes, quite often these are imposed, whether there's restrictions may have been brought in and last minute. So what we're seeing, particularly with a lot of the government changes, that they're imposed with very little notice. Mm-hmm. So I think it's very difficult for airlines to kind of operate within those boundaries. So hopefully when these things start to level off and airlines can be a little bit more confident on their schedules, we'll see less and less of that, and hopefully that trust will return then.
And continuing on the topic of trust, Kei, it'd be great to hear from you. What do you think is going to be the most important innovation that we see to ensure that traveler trust is rebuilt and regained by certain brands? Where do we have opportunity to cater to them and to rebuild that trust?
I think the ability to maybe standardize a taxonomy when we think about what safety means, things like ratings, we've seen really, have a really good impact on helping the decisioning friction that travelers have. So, another example would be like our Greener Choices flag. So I think if we can come together to agree on some measures that help to, that mean the same thing universally as well, then I think we're making a huge step forward for that streamlining and that single taxonomy for education and safety and peace of mind.
That's great. And you've used some of the words I'm going to say. We've come to the end of our session. We have 1 minute left, so I'm going to do a quick round the houses. A lot of times on these events, I've heard people talk about the need for clarity, consistency, and collaboration. If you had to pick one, which one would you say is top priority for our industry over the course of the next 6 months? Kei, you're first on my screen.
I'm going to say collaboration. We've got a shared problem, and I think it's a really unique time in the travel industry. And I think that, with the combined might of all these brains and all these companies focusing on the same thing, there's a really amazing opportunity to push forward and progress. So I'd love to leverage that energy.
David, to you.
I would echo what Kei said, collaboration. And I think important when dealing with governments, with border authorities, we need to have a single message whenever we're talking to them.
Stuart, over to you.
Yeah, probably say the same, simply because it's impossible to be consistent and give clarity at the moment. Therefore, collaboration is required as a fundamental.
Nick?
Well, I probably would say the same, because it's probably the word I use most every day of the week and month. And sometimes I wonder if I'm just saying it too much. But maybe just to turn it on its head, you can't have the consistency or the clarity if there isn't collaboration. And so we really need to be very united and strong as an industry. What Kay was saying is so key. There's so much brain power and brilliance that we can really get together and do some amazing things. So collaboration, without a doubt.
Hugh?
I'm going to be slightly controversial and say, I think we've got collaboration. I've never seen the industry so joined up. I saw 4 airline CEOs standing on the runway at Heathrow, which is an odd thing anyway, last week. And that's never happened before. And we're collaborating to appeal to government. And so my word would be clarity. We can only do from what we know. And if we don't have clarity on stuff, it's impossible to plan and think ahead. So yeah, collaboration with government to give us clarity.
Oh, I'm so glad I saved you for last. Thank you. Thank you to all of our presenters and to panelists today. I really do appreciate the time that you take to come and do this. I think it was an extremely insightful roundtable discussion, especially. And I'm just going to remind everybody, please do visit our partner website if you want any more detail, or if you'd like to have access to this following this. It's just partners.skyscanner.net. And that we're looking forward to seeing you all in person at a travel event very, 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 very soon.